It was a rainy night of March 18th, 1286. The King of Scotland, Alexander III, decides to ride through the night to be with his young French wife, Yolande Drew, against the advice of his companions. Little did anyone know, but the seemingly innocuous decision would shape the future of Scottish history. In the light of morning, after a search by his companions, the king's body was found at the foot of a cliff, dead with a broken neck. In the aftermath of Alexander's tragic demise, not only had the monarch's long and stable reign come to an end, but there was also a much more immediate problem, as the now deceased king had no living offspring who could take the throne. All of his children with Margaret of England had died, and his marriage to Yolande had failed to produce any. Indeed, his closest heir was Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, his granddaughter, the daughter of Eric of Norway, and a Scottish princess. Although perhaps not ideal, as she was just 3 years old, the young girl was now in line to take the throne. All hopes and plans around the maid were soon dashed, however, as Margaret arrived in the Orkney Islands in 1290, but died of illness shortly after, leaving the question of succession open once again. There certainly were individuals with potential claim to the throne, but no clear single answer. Thus, the Scots invited Edward I of England to mediate the dispute, hoping the authority of his presence would allow for a peaceful resolution to the succession. He would see the cases put before him and judge the various claims to the throne, which would ideally prevent infighting among the Scottish nobles. The English king, who had recently subdued Wales, however, planned on being much more than a neutral mediator, and actively sought to project his influence into Scotland. Taking his large army with him, in effect, he planned to make Scotland a vassal. Even before he had chosen a claimant, Edward demanded that the Scottish lords swear allegiance to him, making it clear what his intentions truly were. Although there were 14 contenders, the two most prominent were Robert Bruce, an old man by this time, and John Balliol, an Anglo-Norman lord. Eventually, the noble John Balliol was selected to be king by Edward, but he was little more than a puppet for the English monarch, who essentially demanded that Scotland become his fief. Arguably, John's reign started poorly and did not improve from there. Edward demanded that he personally come to England and effect an act of fealty. Furthermore, when Edward became once again involved in a dispute with Philip of France over Gascony in 1293, he demanded that the Scottish lords perform their duties as vassals and provide him with troops. This was too much. John reneged on his agreement with Edward, and even entered into an alliance with King Philip of France. In effect, at least in Edward's mind, this was nothing but open revolt. Not at all pleased by the overt insubordination from what he viewed as a vassal, Edward was quick to lead his army north. The Scottish were not inactive either, and launched a number of raids into northern England, which, although destructive, did little to slow the English advance. Edward continued north, and the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed was viciously sacked by his army, an act which was seen as heinous even at the time. The Scots rallied and confronted the English vanguard at Dunbar. But here, the Scottish army was quickly routed, and afterwards, Scottish armed resistance largely disintegrated. An important note is that this conflict should not be seen as a war between two nations in a modern-day sense. as much of it revolved around complex feudal obligations and loyalties. For example, the Bruce family did not join in the rebellion, as they had sworn loyalty directly to Edward rather than John Balliol, and even sided with Edward in the dispute. In the aftermath of the victory at Dunbar and ensuing conquest, Edward effectively had control over Scotland. John surrendered by midsummer, and Edward had the captive king disgraced by having the coat of arms torn from his surcoat, an event which earned him the title Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat, before he was sent off to England as a prisoner, a humiliating end to the monarch's short reign. Edward stamped his rule over Scotland, having the nobility swear their allegiance to him again. Furthermore, the Stone of Destiny in Scone, at which Scottish monarchs had been traditionally crowned, was taken to Westminster Abbey. Feeling his subjugation of the country was complete, Edward returned south, leaving affairs to the north in the hands of his subordinates, likely glad that the matter had been dealt with. However, the trouble in Scotland was far from over. Not long after Edward and the main English army left, revolt flared up across the country, most notably by a minor lord named William Wallace in the south, and Andrew Murray in the north, though there were others as well, scattered across the land, resentful at the English king's heavy-handed demands. Wallace killed an English sheriff and massacred his garrison in Lanark before raiding Dunbar, while Murray took control over much of the northeastern regions of Scotland. Busy campaigning on the continent in Flanders, Edward ordered his subordinates to put down the revolt. An English army, commanded by John de Warenne, took the surrender of a disunited Scottish force at Irvine, and it may have seemed to some that the rebellion had been crushed before it had truly begun. In reality, it had barely started. Murray and Wallace were able to march south and north, respectively, in combined forces. Although still relatively small, far from being isolated acts of violence, the Scottish rebels now had a respectable host, which could be called a real army. The Scottish force, under Murray and Wallace, laid siege to Dundee and took up positions to confront the inevitable English relief force. Eventually, an English army, commanded by de Warenne, Hugh de Cressingham, and others, organized itself and set out to confront Wallace's and Murray's force, assuming the Scottish could easily be defeated in the open field. Warren's and Cressingham's army reached the Scottish force facing them on the opposite side of the Forth River. They began to cross, but after some confusion, stopped and went back. The English then sent a few clergy members across to negotiate, but the Scots defiantly sent them away. Although the English host was likely superior in quantity, if not quality, attacking across the meandering river's bridge was a difficult task. The Scots had a very strong defensive position, as the bridge over the river was only wide enough to allow 2 horses to cross abreast, and any force which made it across would find itself in a horseshoe-shaped loop, which then could easily be contained. Some in the English camp warned of the foolishness which attacking directly across the narrow bridge would entail, and suggested that they look for another fording point. For instance, a knight named Richard Lundy asked if he could take a contingent and cross upstream, which could then be used to flank the Scots. These voices were not listened to by the commanders, however, who wanted the affair dealt with as quickly as possible, and decided to attack immediately. The English vanguard, composed of knights and foot soldiers, under Sir Marmaduke Twing and Treasurer Hugh de Cressingham, crossed the bridge over the loop to lead the assault. Seeing this from their vantage point of a ridge, the Scottish commanders urged their army into action. The Scottish infantry formed into a dense hedgehog formation of bristling spears and waded into the English, while others turned against the flank and cut off their line of retreat across the bridge, which also prevented the arrival of any reinforcements from the main English force. In a short while, the English vanguard, which had been caught completely by surprise by the strength of the sudden Scottish attack, had been largely destroyed. The despised tax collector Cressingham was hacked to bits and his body later flayed, though a small English force under Marmaduke Twing managed to cut their way back across to safety. Some of the lightly armed archers were able to swim across the river, but most of the English were unable to maneuver in the boggy terrain and killed. As this happened, the rest of the English army could only watch on helplessly as their comrades were butchered. It was a complete Scottish victory. Despite their success, not everything went in the Scots' favour, as Murray was severely wounded in the fighting and eventually succumbed to his injuries. Despite perhaps still having numerical superiority, the rest of the English army was completely dispirited and withdrew in haste. Wallace captured the major prize of Stirling Castle and eventually raided into northern England, unable to capture any major strongholds, but still inflicting a significant amount of damage. Now having all but driven the English from Scotland, Wallace was made Guardian of the Realm, securing his position. Despite his successes though, only a relatively small English host had actually been defeated, and King Edward was not going to let his conquest go so easily, as Wallace and his allies would soon find out.